Yeah, we can hear you but not see you at this point.
Right, I'll reconvene the hearing for Stream 3 General Rule Zone and welcome the submitters for Greenbrier, and we'll hear from you after we've heard from our council officer. In connection with the 42A report. So over to you, Jo.
Good morning. I just thought it would be prudent to give you a quick overview of my supplementary evidence in relation to the Greenbrier submissions, and also address the MPS component that I sort of put a placeholder in my supplementary evidence while we were waiting for a peer review of the economic evidence provided. So in relation to the submission and further evidence received by Ms. Justice, we've reached some points of agreement. I'll just go through those now quickly. So in relation to the precinct boundary, I accept that there was some confusion in the original submission with the maps provided and therefore the resultant precinct boundary proposed. And I am comfortable to extend it as outlined in Ms. Justice's evidence. I also agree to the changes to the precinct objectives and policies on the basis that they streamline the drafting and still achieve the overall intent of the Section 42A recommended version. In relation to Rule 4 and the rural industry activities enabled in the precinct, I'm happy with enabling 20 customers to visit the site as proposed. And I also note that there, on further consideration of the matters of discretion and reverse sensitivity, I am now comfortable to remove that matter of discretion from Rule 4. I consider that the setback proposed in that rule is a measure to manage effects on neighbours, and should that setback be breached, it'll just be a general effects assessment on those neighbours rather than the reference to reverse sensitivity. The aspects that we are not in agreement on, or where I have not changed anything, relate to Policy 6 in the General Rural Zone. I do not support including the word significant into that policy. And apart from that, I will just give a quick review of the peer review that we commissioned for the economic assessment. This was just to review the methodology used in the report so that we had a balanced approach from my point of view in terms of the weight that I could take that evidence into account. So the peer review was completed by Savvy Consulting, and it is available on the website and was provided to the submitters last night. I think the peer review is thorough. It looked at the methodologies used by Mr. Schultz and also the assumptions used. There were matters of agreement between both parties in terms of a functional and operational need for the mining activity to be where it is. There were a few differences in opinion in relation to the weight given to certain assumptions. But overall, and it was also raised that the MPS HPL doesn't provide much helpful guidance on the methodology to be used or the definition of a national public benefit. So that was just sort of highlighted and raised at the end. Overall, the conclusions of the peer review from Ms. Hampstead, who undertook the review, was, in her opinion, based on how you approached that national benefit. She did see that there was benefit in terms of the mining supply to the manufacturing food industry, and the extent of that in relation to the South Island, which, in her opinion, therefore, could amount to a national public benefit. And in relation to the decision before us today, which is more my recommendation for the precinct to be included in the plan, she considered that that part of the MPS could be met. From my point of view in relation to a planning argument in the MPS HPL, the first step is confirming that there's a national public benefit, and then section 3A of that, I think it's 3.93A, talks about the measures that the territorial authority need to take to ensure that the availability of productive land is minimised or mitigated. And therefore, I consider that in relation to the precinct and including it in the plan, I'm comfortable that there is a pathway through the NPS. But in relation to further consenting requirements, I think it's still necessary to look at the NPS in terms of that further consenting process. I'm happy to take questions on that or discuss further.
I wonder if we hear from Greenbrier and then swing back round.
Well, I've got no questions of Joe, but we'll probably come back to you later on, of course. And so at this point, we'll hand over to Greenbrier and welcome you here and hear your submission. Thank you.
Good morning. So perhaps just introduce our team quickly, and then we've got, I think, what will be a fairly short presentation, given obviously you will have read most of the evidence in advance. So my name's Bridget Irving. I'm counsel for Greenbrier, and we have John Howes with us and my colleague Hannah Perkin. And behind us here we've got Anthony Stoddart, who's the General Manager of the New Vale Mine, who's just come in to observe today. No worries. So obviously we've pre-filed legal submissions. Oh yes, I do. Yeah, thank you. So we've got Andrew Schultz and Meg Justice, both of whom have filed briefs of evidence. I've pre-filed my legal submissions, and Mr. Garbutt also kindly circulated his submissions to us. There doesn't seem to be any significant areas of disagreement, so I'm not inclined to monopolise much of your time today. I'm happy to take any questions in relation to the submissions that have been filed, but I wasn't intending on running through those, given there don't seem to be any sort of significant areas of disagreement or contention on the decision-making framework that you've got to work with. And I think the conversation, well, probably the more interesting discussion is between Mr. Schultz and the comments that have been made by Ms. Hampson in the peer review. And I imagine that's perhaps where your interest might lie. We did set out, obviously, in our legal submissions what guidance there is available in relation to the test of significant public benefit. It isn't a concept that has been tested in any jurisprudence yet, so at the moment we've got available to us in essence the comments and recommending reports for the policy statements themselves and a bit of guidance from the ministry for what that is worth. Ultimately, I think it is a question of fact for you to understand, and each circumstance will be different and will turn on its own facts. And obviously where we have landed through Andrew's input is that in this instance New Vale does meet that criteria due to the sectors that it supplies, the multiple regions that contributes to in the South Island. So that's where we've landed, and it seems that Ms. Hampson ultimately agrees with obviously some comments on alternatives and things like that. So I think there might be questions obviously for Andrew, but yeah. So any questions?
I don't have a question as such. I just want to acknowledge that that the panel had a site visit of the mine, and that was very useful, and noted that the management of the site there was a particular attention to environmental issues, which is good to see. So I have no questions, so I'll hand over to the rest of the panel.
So thank you, John, for that. I think in terms of informing where we've got to today and our understanding, that was extremely helpful. I just want to acknowledge that in the forum that we are today.
Thank you. The legal submissions are really helpful. And I thought it was particularly useful to have the analysis of the relationship of the mine to the emissions reduction plan that we have, understanding that there's another one being batted about at the moment. But, that's just a really useful for us because it's part of our responsibility to deliver. So I just wanted to acknowledge and appreciate that. I think when thinking around this significant national public benefit, you're right, we have to tease out with the expert evidence that we've got around this point. On the legal question at your paragraph 16, perhaps just maybe talk me through a bit here where you've written that national benefit we can safely assume means positive effects felt wider than the local district or region. And I just wanted to tap that a little bit because I would assume also, feeling quite safe in this assumption, that the benefits would have to be felt at the national level to meet the test of national benefit. So I just wanted to check if you would agree with that statement and is that our test as we go into the expert discussion?
I suppose my initial reaction to that is that in some ways they're one and the same thing, whether you build it up from the district, regional, multi-regional level, or look down from the national level and go, well, at what point do we transition from being nationally significant to only district or regionally significant? It strikes me as an issue that doesn't have clear-cut margins, and where that threshold sits in any individual circumstance will be influenced by multiple factors. And those will include, I think, things like the sector that you're dealing with, the regions that you're dealing with, and the significance of the sector to those regions. And then the contribution or relative contribution that might make at a national level. So I don't think that it is as easy as, because I think, I suppose in some ways what I'm saying, when you take any one individual operation, often it would be very difficult to say that individual operation is nationally significant in and of itself. And so you've then got to, I think, look at things in the aggregate. And in this instance, that's what is New Vale facilitating? And what is the relevance of that sector to the national economy and the role that it plays for New Zealand? I'd test the question again with Mr. Schultz, but that I think is where I land on it.
So I followed your logic, and I guess I just we need to be really clear, I think, before we get into the expert exchange, as clear as we can be around what our test is. So just thinking about something like regionally significant infrastructure versus nationally significant infrastructure, and how, I think we're dealing with something similar in terms of thinking about the level at which and why something hits either regional significance or national significance. And I understand that in this case the word significant is not there. It's the benefit word that is our, qualifier or what we're having to demonstrate. And is it a matter of, say, and maybe infrastructure isn't the right way to think about this, and you might come back on me on that, but this is what my brain's doing, so you can help me here. So when I think about regionally significant infrastructure, I'm thinking it's got connections that it's facilitating, and those connections are important to the region, but maybe at the national level it's less of a particular concern, and that the nationally significant infrastructure, those connections extend and can be are sort of visible or lent upon by the nation as a whole. And I think what you were describing just then around the benefit flows, that is our thorny little issue, is to trace the benefit flows. And so you're nodding, so that's great, because so I think you were pointing to the fact that the challenge for any individual operation is to follow that beneficial trace all the way through to the national coffers. Perhaps not just those, because I guess we're not just talking about the financials, are we? No. So we're thinking about economic and social. Probably don't want to go beyond that, but so we should be looking for evidence of those connections and tracing the benefit flow, and then the level at which that is influencing outcomes at the regional level and at the national level.
Yes, I think so. And I think if to use your infrastructure, I suppose, analogy, perhaps one way to think about it would be what would happen if New Vale couldn't operate, or if Edendale couldn't operate. What would that mean for the economics of Southland, of the wider area that factory draws its product from the suppliers that provide services, products, and so on to that factory? They are significant operations that, I suppose, have tendrils that go in all sorts of directions, that cross boundaries, that support ultimately families and communities. And so that's sort of similar, I think, to the infrastructure example. And you might say, well, at a regional level, we have electricity distribution networks, for example, something I'm fairly familiar with, and I think an example where this issue arises, they're providing a way of transporting the benefit of electricity from local resources through to the national grid, but also back from the national grid and into communities and families and so on. And in some ways, the service that New Vale provides supports and facilitates flows of benefits between different parts of the economy at quite a large scale when you look at the numbers that Andrew's analysed.
I think that's helpful. The other thing that's happening for me, well, thinking about electricity generation, the national grid clearly has, it just passes the national significance test. It gets to a node, and then that node connects to the regional distribution, and generally, in my experience, the regional distribution bit is plonked in the regional significance camp, and it's the national grid trunk that gets elevated to national significance. So, yeah, so my brain is also doing this around sort of nodes and thinking about even, say, the roading network where you've had big outages that have cut off a region of the country that is quite crippling for that region of the country. So I'm thinking about when the East Coast has been sliced off. You know, it's pretty catastrophic for the region, but the country has kind of boxed on. And so when I'm thinking about regional significance and national significance, I'm really trying to grapple with, you know, I think it's just such a, I take your point that it's a very big challenge for an individual operation to demonstrate this national benefit. And I think, you know, there's, yeah. So I guess that's probably where I would leave it, but I'm happy for you to come back to me on anything that I've just said, either now or as we go through. Yeah. Because I think it is kind of core to that aspect. One other thing that I wouldn't mind, because the focus on the significant national public benefit is arising out of the implementation of the MPS, I think I'm recalling our exchange from hearing stream 1. So I wouldn't mind just testing this a little bit in terms of actually the primary objective of the MPS HBL is the, for want of, I'm going to rephrase it rather than use the phrasing from the MPS to test if my understanding of it matches how you would approach it. But when I'm looking at what it's trying to achieve, it's thinking very long term about not wanting to cut off future land-based primary production capability, and that its genesis had a lot to do with built form encroaching into land-based primary production at high quality. Yep, so I'm getting lots of nods. And that from your evidence in hearing stream 1 and from what we've seen from coming on site, the mine is progressively rehabilitated into productive pasture. So I wondered, while we're going to spend quite a bit of time thinking about significant national public benefit, is another core thing that we have to be thinking about is what is the class of soil and productive capacity coming out the back of the rehabilitation? Because that originally was what I was thinking about, just wondering, you know, we've got this class of soil as you go in and you do the mine, and then you're doing all your rehabilitation coming out the back. Are we still talking about that same highly productive soil capability when we come out the other side? To me, that's quite a core idea that's central to the objective of the MPS HBL, which is what we have to achieve. So again, you're nodding and that's helpful. So it's a way for me to flag also that I'm quite interested in that question and how that might come through the evidence.
Just, sorry.
Yeah, I think you're right that question, that I suppose we're on a continuum in terms of, is the highly productive land completely disappearing, what proportion of it might be completely disappearing, if any, and where do we land at the end of the mining activity in terms of the capacity of the site to support land-based primary production into the future. And I'll perhaps let John speak to that when he is called to give his evidence further around how the rehabilitated land works and how it's able to be utilised, and I think that might assist you. But yeah, I mean, the MPS HPL itself obviously has these suite of exceptions, and the nature of mining activity is almost, in some respects, temporary, but doesn't fit into the temporary activities exclusion that sits in the MPS HPL, and it's obviously got its own one. But there is definitely, I suppose, shades of that sort of temporary nature, where ultimately the vast majority of the site at the end of the mining activity will be available for land-based primary production again. Yeah. So I suppose in that respect we get the best of both worlds potentially. The opportunity to use the energy resource within the site whilst also retaining that future productive potential of the mined area. Or most of it, not quite all of it goes back into primary production. But
I know in the past that site's had the benefit of a soil scientist giving you advice, I think a guy from Lincoln. I'm assuming that advice is still being available.
I don't think we've done any of that work in recent times with soil scientists. We pretty much do soil tests, have a look at the soil chemistry, and then get advice on what we need to do from there. Historically, quite some years ago, we had done a wee bit of work with a few consultants, but that was more people coming to the mine wanting to collect information from us rather than us engaging them as an expert. The Lincoln scientist, I don't recall.
Look, it probably is some time ago, and I guess I'm here to hear your evidence, not to give mine, but I have spoken to a soil scientist out there and asked him actually how we would take on such a difficult profession, soil science and the physics around it. But yes, if you did have any information like that, maybe sometime in the future that would be beneficial.
Ready to move on?
yeah, okay. So I'll call John Howes now to speak to his brief.
Probably I should start with talking about one thing, the sort of the red herring in the room is, and it came out in the review that we saw last night, is the uncertainty about transition away from coal. And it's actually very difficult. There is an awful lot of uncertainty about it. It's not as straightforward as identifying biomass as a solution or electricity as a solution. They both have huge challenges, and it was also touched on the report that, for example, biomass is a cheap alternative. And I think Andrew's going to speak to those figures afterwards. The reason that we've planned through to the end of mine life is we don't know ourselves what coal demand will be. There's a number of things driving this. There's uncertainty of demand, as we have seen smaller customers who can more easily transition away from coal do that, whether they go to electricity or they're going to biomass. as the bigger customers look at those alternatives, there's uncertainty about supply and the reliability of supply. There's also an issue with the alternatives and the fact that there's a significant increase in cost. And then the bigger you are, of course, there's a large capital expenditure in the investment of new boilers. It's not as simple as just putting wood chips into a coal boiler. They really need to have purpose-built boilers installed, and then all of the consenting for that. So that's, I just wanted to highlight that we don't really have any uncertainty. And the other thing for us as a supplier, seeing supply drop away, is other mines who we currently compete with are much closer to the end of mine life. So there's the potential that their customers will become our customers. The second point that we've just been talking about, which is the rehabilitation of the mine, there might be some historic work that's been done, but we probably need to we'd need to have a look at our archives for that. We haven't done in recent times any suite of testing before and after rehabilitation. Effectively what we do is we do soil tests, we look at the chemistry after it's been rehabilitated, and we add chemical fertilisers till the land's reasonably productive. The other thing we do is we keep young stock on it, so we don't destroy the structure of the soil, and generally after 2 years we fully hand that land back to the lessee. Another one of the challenges that we have is we don't farm the land, it's given to a lessee to farm. But I do take aboard that that's something that we need to have a look at in more detail in future, so we can gather that evidence.
Yeah, I think it's part of, well, the way that I read the objective of the MPS to protect highly productive land. I guess we need to know that we're doing that and that we've got highly productive land coming out the other side. I think it's very helpful that you've got your regular soil testing going on. So at the moment, it's probably something that we don't have in the, explored further in the evidence suite at the moment. I think it's an important part of the picture, yeah. So thank you for that. I might also want to appreciate that what you were saying around the stage at which your competitors are in terms of approaching end of mine life sooner than New Vale. And when I think about what's sitting in the legal submissions, helping us understand the relationship of the mine with the emissions reduction plan that we currently have, are you thinking about New Vale? Well, one way to potentially look at it is that New Vale are part of the transition phase towards the low emissions economy. So you're describing some customers falling away, taking up the lower emissions technologies, that kind of thing. But until such time as, all the customers have gone through that process. But in that, would you think of that as a transition in New Vale's role in that transition?
I think what you're saying is very accurate. I think we'd see ourselves in the next few years in the Southland Otago area as the last man standing.
it did seem to me from reading that passage in the legal submissions that there is just a very clear dovetail between the available resource that you've identified left in the mine and some of these targets and objectives. It was quite an important piece of the puzzle, I think, in terms of the evidence that you've given us. So thank you.
Just as a bit of background, I know there's ongoing rehabilitation and there's been mining out in that area for a long, long time. Would you hazard a guess as to how much has actually been rehabilitated into pastoral farming from, you know, over an extended time? Don't need it down to the last, you know, square metre.
I couldn't guess. You know, my knowledge is pretty recent,
Yeah.
but it wouldn't be difficult with aerial photographs to figure it out.
I actually think it's quite important too for us as a panel to think about the amount of coal that's being imported into the country. So you're contributing to coal in the region and in the country. So could that be seen as a national public benefit?
I suspect that's a question for Mr. Schultz about the relative costs or benefits of that. I think there's possibly a broader consideration around would we prefer to be utilising coal resources sourced locally with the techniques that we know and understand in New Zealand versus international sources. But I don't think you've got evidence specifically on that. So I think you're left with Mr. Schultz's evidence around the sort of cost benefit of that from an economic point of view.
I think there is some reference to that in your studies. Back to you and your expert evidence.
No.
So I think John's finished if there's no more questions of him. So next I would call Mr. Schultz, please, who is online.
Good morning. I hope I'm coming in loud and clear.
Good morning. I invite you to proceed. What's your areas of expertise, Mr. Schultz?
Yeah, thank you. I'm a senior economist for Sense Partners. So my areas of expertise cover transport economics, international trade economics, which is a particular specialty of our firm, and we do a lot of work in resource management space as well. This is a project that is the intersection of all three of those things, because a big part of the cost of coal energy is going to be that transport element, and a big part of the alternatives assessment is also looking at the international supply of coal. I didn't really want to just repeat what is in my evidence, so I did just want to give the panel as much time as possible to ask questions. I have looked at the peer review this morning, and probably the one, or the two main things I'd just like to touch on there is, first of all, is the purpose of an emissions trading scheme. So it was raised in the peer review that the Climate Change Commission, which I've used a lot of their projections, they're thinking that there'll be a reduction in coal use of around 1.4 petajoules per year through to 2030. So the purpose of an emissions trading scheme is to provide economy-wide flexibility. It allows the economy to target emissions reductions where they are the most cost effective, and it also allows us to use offsetting where it's cost effective. And what that means is reductions in energy use aren't necessarily going to be uniform across all regions or across all sectors of the economy. So we have assumed a relatively constant demand in coal consumption, or coal demand for New Vale coal. John mentioned that part of that assumption is absorbing demand from other end-of-life coal mines. But this is not at all inconsistent with an emissions trading scheme that is successfully reducing emissions, because Southland has a lot of sources of cheaper coal. We would expect that more of the emissions reduction is going to happen in other parts of the country where coal is more expensive. It also touches on the alternatives to coal, the one that is most popularly discussed is the woody biomass, the cost of which is highly contextual, because transport costs of woody biomass are a major component of the costs, and so parts of the economy that are situated close to large forestry operations are going to have an advantage in that respect, and so that's where we'd expect to see more emissions reductions compared to other parts of the economy. So an assumption of stable demand is not inconsistent with an emissions trading scheme that reduces carbon emissions. The other main point I just wanted to touch on is again the alternatives. We didn't analyse it in detail because the information we have is that woody biomass is quite a lot more expensive than coal alternatives. So for example, talking to John this morning, some of the indicative numbers are that for wood pellets, which are a manufactured form of woody biomass that has been dried out, the cost could be in excess of $500 a tonne, compared to New Vale lignite, which can be around $130 a tonne, including the cost of carbon, which is in the emissions trading scheme. So it's significantly more expensive. Likewise with wood chips, which aren't as processed. They're a lot cheaper, but they still get upwards of $240 a tonne, and lower energy content, meaning there's a much higher transport cost because you need a lot more of it. This is on top of the potential capital costs of having to switch boilers. So we at an early stage discounted woody biomass on the basis that it was a lot more expensive than the alternative coal sources. Those are the two main things I thought were material in the peer review. However, I would just like to open up to questions from the panel.
Thank you for. I'm not seeing any questions coming from the rest of the panel, so I'm going to jump in. So I followed your analysis, and the conversation that I just had with Mr. Howes around that dovetailing of the anticipated life of New Vale with the National Emissions Reduction Plan, when you were talking about the different parts of the country, you know, responding differently, and that's part of the design of an intention of our ETS system.
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
And so that that anticipated end of life of New Vale out to 2038, and Mr. Howes describing New Vale as last man standing, is that kind of core to your assessment here?
It's not necessarily core to it, because ultimately the emissions trading scheme, if it's followed through on, if they maintain the cap on emissions, it will achieve those reductions. So may be that as time goes on, new abatement technologies come online, new offsetting technologies come online that allow emissions to be reduced at a much cheaper rate in other parts of the economy. So it's not necessarily like dependent on this being the only source of coal left. It may very well be that other parts of the economy just take advantage of cheap abatement that is relatively cheap compared to trying to switch away from coal in Southland. And really the emissions trading scheme is trying to achieve a national reduction in emissions. And by intent, it's agnostic about whether those emissions reductions are achieved uniformly across the country, if they're entirely achieved in certain concentrated sectors or not.
So on the offsetting element there, so again, that's a key component of the ETS and signals we're getting around what might change in terms of the emissions reduction plan nationally. But in the dialogue around that, there is this argument that, you know, offsetting will only help you for a period of time, and then you've got to actually cut into the source emissions themselves. And so that's perhaps where I was thinking around, well, I'm probably thinking around the extent to which we have to worry about this when we've got a mine that has an end of life pending. I guess that's where I'm coming from.
I think the design of an emissions trading scheme is you don't actually have to worry about offsetting versus reducing gross emissions. For example, the current most effective strategy to offset is to plant more trees. And you can make the observation eventually you're going to run out of space to plant trees. And because this is a market mechanism, it's going to anticipate the fact that eventually you'll run out of space to plant trees, or you'll be eating into far more valuable dairy land, for example. And so the price of emissions permits are going to rise accordingly. And then it'll prompt industry and households to start reducing their gross emissions. So offsetting through things like planting or something, it's a good short-term method to get net emissions reductions, and it's quite cost-effective. We don't really have to worry about the fact that it's time limited, because the emissions trading scheme will take that into account.
But do we have to think about the length of time that the ETS has been in play, and about the span of emissions and carbon sequestration that can happen from forestry planting? You know, you only get your 20-25 years of sequestration before you hit equilibrium with your planting and replanting if it's a harvested situation, and you do get a bit longer with native versus the fast growing exotics. But given that, so I guess I'm throwing that in there because I think time is a matter that we do need to think about, which is why I'm pointing to the time for end of life of this mine. I'm just suggesting that it's not just about land space, and obviously there are tensions there that we do have to manage at a district plan level, according to community expectations. So that is something that's kind of in our purview through this hearing to do. But I just wanted to push back a little bit on your idea of time there, how much time we have, to achieve the core emissions abatement, because the trees are really only buying a bit of time to achieve those cuts. And if you don't do the cuts, by the time the carbon sequestration cycle has done its job, then you're well on the back foot by then.
Yeah, so it's a question of who has to do the anticipating. regulators or is it individual polluters? The intention of an emissions trading scheme is that it's individual polluters, whether it's households, whether it's firms. So the firms with the forward-looking view will anticipate that eventually we're going to run out of options. Most probably won't wait until the day we run out before they start making moves. And all of that behaviour at an aggregate level in the economy is going to be reflected in the emissions price. So as we roll out forestry or whatever offsetting technology, as it becomes clear that there's a limit to that, the market is going to react to that well in advance. Some people will purchase emissions permits in anticipation that the price is going to go up later, and that brings price rise forward. So the intention of an emissions trading scheme is that that the regulators don't have to be forward-looking and don't have to try and anticipate those things, because it's about pushing it back onto individual consumers and producers who are using those emissions.
So I'm going to actually push back on your statement there, because I think the ETS is a tool that is behaving the way that you're describing, providing those flexibility. Like, I'm following all of that, not a problem. I think, again, why I was thinking Greenbrier's legal submission point around the relationship between this mine and the emissions reduction plan is because it's not just the ETS that's the tool. The regulating function we do have is to give effect to the National Emissions Reduction Plan and the National Adaptation Plan. Obviously, we're talking about emissions reduction. It's part of our job as a panel to do that, and that is a regulatory function. And the National Emissions Reduction Plan and the work of the Climate Change Commission and the Act, the Climate Change Response Act, they are parts of a system for climate change response, and the ETS is one part of that system. So as regulators, we do have a very clear function, and we've got legal submissions guiding us on that. So yeah, I'm understanding everything that you're saying, though, in terms of the value of the flexibility of the ETS and the options available for any individual business. So I do appreciate your point there. I just needed to push back because actually it is a regulatory function that we have a responsibility for. Kia ora.
That's fair. I'm coming at it from an economic efficiency point of view, perhaps not necessarily what current regulation requires the panel to look at. The sort of economic logic is, if you have an emissions trading scheme with a cap, if you take certain actions outside of that emissions trading scheme to reduce emissions, all you may achieve is you actually reduce the price of the ETS because you're reducing emissions elsewhere, which might just prompt a producer to slightly offset delay their response, delay their reductions, because suddenly the price of the carbon in the ETS has gone down. So if you were to say cease production at New Vale, in order for that to have an effect on emissions, you would also have to then lower the cap in the emissions trading scheme by a corresponding amount. So I'm not aware that would be the case. So the effect of that would actually just be you'd free up emissions permits for someone else to use. So net emissions wouldn't go down.
So that's where the national system comes into play, doesn't it, in terms of the ratcheting of availability of, the cap and those levers that can be pulled. So those are the things that are pulled at the national level that drive down, ultimately over time, drive down at the emissions. And I think do you agree that a core purpose for the ETS scheme isn't to maintain the market itself, but the purpose of that, creating that market, was to ensure emissions reductions at source over time?
I'm just going to cut in here. We're starting to drift into areas that are going to be driven from the top down, from national policy, rather than being driven. We're starting to drift into areas where I don't think we can get any definitive answer. I take your point of our responsibility, but I think I would like to move on.
So in terms of the purpose of the evidence, I guess it's a paragraph 7 was to, with regard to the test of whether the significant national public benefit couldn't otherwise be achieved using resources in New Zealand. We've got your evidence, we've got a peer review of that. Does that peer review in any way undermine the conclusions that you have reached?
No. It's a bit of an interesting one because the peer reviewer has slightly disagreed with how I've defined significant benefit in terms of I've looked at, for example, employment in the context of GORE, and I've estimated it's about 1.12% of GORE's economy. The peer reviewer has said that they don't think that that's significant. This is kind of where we get at the whole ambiguity of the test, because for a single employer to have that effect is pretty significant in any context. It's going to be very different. There'll be very few employers in any context who have that or a much greater contribution to, say, GDP or employment. So yeah, it's a small number in terms of 1% isn't very much of 100%, but for a single employer to achieve that is fairly significant. I mean, we probably look at examples of small factory towns where you might have a factory in a small village where the factory is the dominant employer. In those sort of instances, you might get higher figures, but those aren't very common. So I suppose it comes down to what's the intent of the NPS HPL. Is it to say significant must be some sort of, dominant level? Is it some sort of they must have a majority of employment? It's not clear. But I would say that in terms of a single firm having that contribution on jobs, it's meaningful. It's certainly meaningful to the core economy. But at the same time, the peer reviewer then said, well, actually, we've still met the definition of significant public benefit, because although the direct contribution, in their opinion, isn't that meaningful, the indirect contribution that we've highlighted, they do believe is meaningful. So sort of, they ultimately agree with our conclusion, they just slightly disagree with the logical steps we've taken to get there.
I also saw some divergence between the assumptions that were used, but my interpretation, you've confirmed that the conclusion that they reach is the significant public benefit test has been met, and I think that's probably the key point to take from both the peer review and your evidence. Thank you.
Yeah, I need to, on the points that you just made around significance in thinking about district and wider. So because I am also sitting over on the West Coast, I'm deeply familiar with the relationship of Stockton and the Bulla Coalfield Zone with the Bulla District, for instance. So there you do have a single employer, and the level of contribution in the Bulla District, is significantly higher than what we're talking about here. So my reason for raising that is, should we be a bit mindful of some comparative analysis in going through this exercise? And so the obvious one for me is to think about the relationship of the Buller Coal Zone, Buller Coal Field, and that Stockton mine with the Buller District, and then its role in contributing regionally and nationally. So I've got a very tangible example that I'm working with in another jurisdiction that obviously I have in my mind when I'm looking at this example in this jurisdiction. So I think it would be enormously helpful to put this in context comparatively.
Yeah, so the one thing I'd mention is an interesting question, because if you sort of say took the Stockton mine in the context of the West Coast, it's very significant. If you took, let's say, a mine of exactly the same proportions and exactly the same national contribution, and it was, hypothetically speaking, just outside of Auckland, you go from saying it has a significant benefit to an insignificant benefit when we're talking about a mine of exactly the same output, employment, and so on. So it's a bit of it's like a spatial analysis conundrum, because you can kind of choose the area of analysis to suit whatever argument you want to make.
Although isn't you've pointed to a core thing, which is that we're talking about percentages in the context, right? So the context for employment in the district, and you can do that, with percentages, and that enables you to do comparisons whether you're talking about an economy that's yay big or yay big. So I would think that it's quite possible to do a comparative analysis along those lines.
Oh, absolutely. It's possible to do a comparative analysis. Sorry, the purpose of my comment wasn't to negate that at all. It was just to point out that it's a bit odd that we could take an employer, look at them in the context of a small economy, conclude that they're significant, and we could compare them to another employer who employs the exact same number of people, generates the exact same contribution to GDP, but because they happen to be in Auckland, which is very big, or Christchurch, or another big city, that their contribution, which is exactly the same, wouldn't be significant because it's a relative term.
And so I'm following that, and that's actually why I'm asking the question in some respects, because that's exactly right. As you move from the district level and its contribution in the district to its contribution in the region, and you're getting bigger economic scale, the visibility of the contribution in relation to that diminishes, right? So then the significance as you move up from district to region to national, in order to be significant and visible and sort of hit that importance at the national level, that is what we're considering here. And so the comparative analysis with, another operation that has a core relationship with a district that can be described, and then a core relationship with a region that can be described, and all the way up to the national level. That has been done quite recently in another jurisdiction doing a similar exercise. And the test that we've got is to know, to get a proper sense of national benefit. I don't see how you can do that without a decent comparative analysis across regions where you've got examples that you can draw from. And because I can see one immediately relevant, we've got to have some kind of benchmarking, presumably, to to hit that national level, as opposed to just coming at it from a single enterprise, which is very useful. I'm not diminishing the value of what you've done. I think it's really important to us, and I very much appreciate that. But I'm just pointing to the fact that a national benefit analysis, I would imagine, would need to have a comparative element, and that I'd be looking for that.
I think that's a fair point, and I think as time goes by and we sort of get and establish how we can do these sorts of things, and it sort of becomes an established benchmark for how to determine significance. So that was the challenge we were faced as certainly we weren't aware of any other work that did define what significance was. So, and I think partly it's in terms of, well, what is the intent of the legislation, which I can't talk to the intent, but I can provide an economic interpretation, which is we can view this as a significant contribution. Is that the intended view of what significance is? I don't know. I agree that maybe a comparative analysis might help. The one other thing I would say is, particularly in terms of the mining sector, this is almost one of the last operating mines in Southland. If it were to shut down, the people who work here who have possibly quite specialised skills in the mining sector, the suppliers they draw on who are possibly quite specialised in the mining sector, could they find new jobs in Southland? If they have a lot of expertise in the mining sector and they switch over to another industry, they might be penalised for that because their experience and expertise might not count for much in a different sector. And so it might be that they have to go overseas or to another part of New Zealand where mining is still quite active in the event that this might shut down. So for Southland, the ability of the Southland economy to kind of absorb the people who would lose their jobs and the suppliers who would lose a customer, it might be fairly limited. If there were several other mines operating in the region, for example, then actually it would have a much greater capacity to absorb those. So in terms of being one of the last operating mines in the region, it implies that the region would have a bit of difficulty reallocating those resources. It probably is quite significant.
I'll thank you for those points, Mr. Schultz, and I think it's a matter that we'll consider in the deliberations as a panel, where we're starting to get into areas which we can't define for the purpose of today's submissions. Do you have anything to add? Back to you. Thank you very much. If we require some more detail, we may come back to you.
Yeah, I might circle back to the evidence question at the end after we've heard from Ms. Justice.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Justice. We'll hear from you now.
Good afternoon, everybody. I had prepared a brief summary statement that I was planning to read out. However, just based on timing, I appreciate we're just about out of our time slot.
I'd appreciate hearing your statement. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I appreciate hearing your statement. I wouldn't worry too much about time. Lunch can wait.
Okay, so what I've prepared is a summary statement. I haven't got anything new in here in terms of evidence, so I'm not introducing any new material. So the purpose of my evidence is to discuss Greenbrier's submission points that relate to the rural general zone. By way of background, coal mining operations have been undertaken in the area for over 120 years. The Newvale coal mine was developed in the 1940s. Approximately 175 hectares of the site is used for an active coal mining operation. the balance of the land is used as sheep and beef farmland or is used for environmental improvement or enhancement works. The site is zoned a mixture of rural and industrial zoning under the operative district plan. The proposed district plan, as notified, removed the industrial zoning over part of the site and replaced it with the general rural zoning. The site is classified as LUC3 under the MPS HPL, meaning that it is classified, currently at least, as highly productive land. Greenbrier holds existing resource consents which authorise the existing mining operations at the site. Greenbrier are currently seeking resource consent for an expansion to its mining operation at New Vale. The resource consent application would enable the mine's current operating life to extend to approximately 2038. Section 42A report author has proposed the inclusion of a New Vale precinct in response to Greenbrier's submission. I have reviewed this and I support the Section 42A report author's recommendations. Overall, the provisions recommended by the Section 42A report author are, in my view, appropriate. And, I did suggest a few amendments to those provisions in my evidence, which are attached as Appendix D. And just to cover off the key themes of my evidence first, and then I'll come back to the matters where Ms. Skuse and I don't agree, and that relates to two submission points. So in terms of the key themes, at paragraph 36 of my evidence, I describe the importance of a precinct to allow the continuation and expansion of the existing New Vale mine, while the mine's key customers, which are predominantly meat and dairy processing plants, transition from coal to renewable energy sources. And that's estimated to occur, as you've heard from various parties this morning, by 2040. At paragraphs 21 to 32 of my evidence, I have demonstrated the proposed precinct and the use of the site as enabled by the precinct is not an inappropriate use under the MPS for HPL. My evidence demonstrates, with reliance on Mr. Schultz's evidence, that the tests in clause 3.9 of this MPS can be achieved. And I just note that the peer review of that report also did reach that conclusion. At paragraphs 43 to 64 of my evidence, I make recommendations for further amendments to the New Vale precinct and some of the rural general zone provisions. One of the key benefits of applying a precinct over the site is to provide the ongoing certainty that the mine can continue to operate while providing guidance for decision makers when assessing resource consent applications for any significant expansion of the mine within the precinct boundaries. And just on that point, any expansion to the mine would require a resource consent under the precinct rules, so the precinct doesn't avoid the need to obtain a resource consent and consider the effects that are listed in the matters of discretion associated with such an activity. I think we've just covered the precinct map, but at Appendix A of my evidence is the map which includes the entire Greenvale site, which includes the land off to the east, which is predominantly the area Greenbrier are using for ecological enhancement works. So in my view, it's appropriate that the precinct includes that area as well. Overall, in my view, the New Vale precinct will enable the sustainable management of the existing mine by recognising the significant role it plays in supporting primary production activities in the Lower South Island and providing for the continuation and expansion of the mining activities at the site. So the two provisions which the planners, myself and Mr. Goetz haven't agreed on is the wording of policy 6. And in my evidence I suggested that the word significant be included in there. The reason I've done that is that I am concerned that the wording of the policy requires a blanket avoidance of all adverse effects as a first step where practicable. In my view, that's not supported in the higher level policies. I've read Ms. Stuart's reply this morning, and if the policy was worded along the lines that she suggested in her evidence, so if it was worded avoid, remedy or mitigate adverse environmental effects, I think that would be acceptable. But the way it's currently set out with the effects management hierarchy structure in part, I think it could be interpreted to mean that at all adverse effects need to be avoided. And for a mining activity, that would be a very high hurdle to get across. And I don't think it's justified by higher level policy direction.
Can you just hold there for a moment, please? Thank you. Continue.
And so the other matter which relates to GRUS Rule 2, in my evidence I've recommended that there's an exclusion added into that rule, into clause 2 of the rule, which would exempt the New Vale precinct from having to consider the NPS for highly productive land. And that's on the basis that the evidence that Mr. Schultz has presented is that the activity already satisfies clause 3.9 of the NPS HBL, and therefore going through that hurdle each time a resource consent is made is not necessary. I just want to point out that any application for a new mine or an extension to the mine at New Vale would fall into the restricted discretionary category under that rule R2. And one of the matters of discretion, which is clause 7, is the need to demonstrate that highly productive soils can be retained after the site has been rehabilitated. So I think that was something that Commissioner Bartlett was discussing before. There will be a need under this rule framework for Greenbrier to demonstrate that the soils can be rehabilitated to a highly productive state after any mining activities have occurred.
So can I just check your point on this rule where you were pointing to the highly productive land aspect? We're anticipating that New Vale are going to fall under the restricted discretionary pathway.
Yes.
So how important is it then in relation to the permitted element of the rule around highly productive land, i.e. we're actually the framework's being written sort of imagining that there'll be a consent pathway and these matters will be addressed. So I was just curious about what the purpose would be of making any adjustment to to the PA on that particular point.
Yes, in practice, I think you're right. Any expansion to the mining at New Vale wouldn't be able to achieve clause 1, which is the scale threshold of the mining activity. So it's automatically going to be under this restricted discretionary category in any case. So in that sense, the additional wording I've suggested probably isn't entirely necessary. However, it does allude to the point that Ms. Scouse made in her evidence that the tests under clause 3.9 of the NPS HBL would need to be assessed under any subsequent resource consent application.
Have you?
And I think including that additional wording in clause 2 of the rule, might reduce the need for that assessment because it's already been demonstrated.
So, and so have you finished your comments?
Yes, I have.
So you indicated that there's a consent being applied for to which councils?
To the Gore District Council, and there's also a resource consent with Environment South.
Okay. I'm a little confused by your paragraphs 46 and 47. I read 46 where you're saying that the objectives read like policies and aren't required, and then the same objective numbers are necessary. Can you clarify that before I ask the second part?
Sorry, can you repeat that? lost you a little bit there.
Okay, so paragraph 46, you say in the middle of that, when you read the complete suite of objectives alongside the proposed general rural zone objectives, you noted that the precinct objectives read like policies and are not required to be included as objectives. But then in paragraph 47, you say you consider the same objectives are necessary.
I think if you follow through in my evidence, I recommended that they become part of the same policy. So, sorry, same objective.
Okay,
So I've
right.
suggested that they're retained but just embedded into the one objective.
Right, so I've gone back and pulled out the submission that was lodged by Newbriar, and submission 128.062 related to the objectives. And what was in the column of the summary indicated that there was a fourth objective that was being asked for as well, relating to rehabilitation. And so it kind of opens up the objective framework that we have here. And I guess what we've got before us is still objectives that read like policies. And given your statement in paragraph 46 that the general rule ones seem to be sufficient, why do we need an additional objective altogether?
I mean, but my first response would be in terms of the framework of the objectives in this chapter, there is an objective for precinct 13. So having a specific objective for precinct 14 would follow that framework.
So we probably only need one objective that is an enabling objective, and anything else can be picked up in the policies. Would that be a fair conclusion?
Yes, I definitely think that's a fair conclusion.
And I think the 42A, yeah, I'm interested in the planner's response to that too, please.
Yeah, I was just having a look at the revised provisions that fell out of my supplementary evidence, and we just have the one objective for precinct 14. The objective above is precinct 13, which is the rural industry precinct. So off the back of Ms Justice's recommendation, we just streamlined where we previously had three objectives into just the one.
So the two bullet points, do we need them at all as part of an objective?
I think so, because they are describing an outcome, and then the policies give effect to them along with the rules. I think the points that we're touching on in those objectives are really important in relation to the mine. We're talking about effects management and then the rehabilitation.
So I guess one of the outcomes that you are wanting to achieve is for an addition to be made to the plan that avoids or limits the scope of what can be looked at later in terms of the high-class soils. To what degree, what difference will it make if you've got a consent going through now? Clearly any changes aren't going to help that process. And if that is the case, are there likely to be further consents in the future? If not, what is the benefit of making the addition?
The question of whether there will be future consents is probably one for Mr. Howes. However, I think just in terms, there's always, with activities such as mining, there are quite often instances where resource consents will be required. It might not be for a full-scale mine extension as is going through the process at the moment. But there might be works in terms of the rehabilitation works for new buildings, etc. So I think in that respect it is a safety net, if you like, that provides for the mine, particularly with the removal of the industrial zoning. But I take your point that, you know, the big project going through at the moment is already lodged with the council and being processed. Just also the other sort of good thing about a precinct is that it retains the underlying rural zone. So when the mine does cease to operate, the rural zone provisions will kick in and that land can be managed under those provisions. So it's quite an efficient method to use.
Just a slight aside, I imagine, or I'm asking you actually, I shouldn't be imagining anything, that when the mine ceases to operate, there'll be a small lake left behind.
Correct.
But the soil that was on top of that area will actually be reclaimed and deposited, obviously above ground.
That just gets distributed over the rest of the rehabilitated pasture.
I've got no more questions.
I've got one more just related to the point you were making around the effects management hierarchy, and where you, in that policy 6 in your evidence, suggesting the addition of the word significant. I think in order to have a sensible conversation about that, it'd be really good to understand, in terms of an effects management hierarchy, are you drawing from any of the higher level instruments in this case, where we know we've got a couple that have got an effects management hierarchy specifically written into them, but looking above at the regional policy statement and higher order instruments, are you drawing on any of those in your analysis here?
Well, I've made the example that the NPS for Indigenous biodiversity only requires the avoidance of significant adverse effects on Indigenous biodiversity. It's not directly related to this particular policy, but that was the only one that I could find that did have the word. Sorry, that didn't have the word significant in it. So.
Yeah, and I'm more, because, you know, kind of familiar with the way an effects management hierarchy works, and it does have a cascade built in. So there's a difference between acknowledging all those tools that are available in the law, like avoid, remedy, mitigate, offset, compensation, all those tools are available in any given setting, but the effects management hierarchy is coming to us through different instruments and then sets a cascading approach in terms of, you know, do this one first, then head here, and then if you can't deal with all that, you're left with these matters. So I just wanted to understand, you know, if we're going to employ that sort of approach, you know, what are we leaning on, as opposed to the idea that those tools are available in the Act, you know. So and whether we need to be applying a hierarchy, which might be valuable to do, but just understanding why we're doing it, what are we drawing on, what are we pulling on if we're putting a hierarchy in.
Yeah, I mean, I think those tools are useful, and they do appear in numerous of the national policy statements that councils are required to give effect to. They are all slightly different and slightly nuanced in each national policy statement. from my review of them. So I think if they are to be implemented into a district council document such as this, the wording has to be, very carefully considered and perhaps aligned with what the national policy statements say, and that could result in having more than one provision, or at least separate provisions that relate to different environmental effects.
Yeah, I think that's probably where I was coming from in terms of being really clear about why we're doing it and what we're talking about when we do employ it. I think that is where I was coming from, which isn't to say that an effects management hierarchy approach isn't potentially of value and might be employed outside of what those directions are telling us to do. It's just that I think we need to be very clear about when and why. Yeah.
I've no more questions. Further comments from Greenbrier, or even comments from the reporting officer?
Yeah, can I address a couple of the matters that have come up in the context of questions?
Please do.
First one I think relates to, I suppose, the climate change emissions reduction. Where does that fit in? And I think in the submissions that we filed in relation to hearing stream 1, I think both ourselves and council for the council provided a framework, which was your sort of decision-making framework. And I think it's important to refer back to that and look at where the emissions reduction plan fits in that process. And I think it'll be where you have to have regard to other plans and strategies prepared under other acts. So there's no doubt it is relevant, but it's not, I suppose, sitting high up in terms of the hierarchy or the degree of weight that needs to be given, I think, through the decision-making process. So I think just be conscious of that when you're considering this particular activity. I think in terms of the timing question and the what the precinct will support in terms of the development of the mining activity at New Vale and where that sits, I suppose, relative to the current emissions reduction plan and the anticipated phase out of coal for process heat by 2040. In some ways, that's a function of the resource available rather than a conscious decision, and that is what it is. It's certainly convenient in terms of the activities that rely on the resource and what they need to do in order to, I suppose, assist with the implementation of that emissions reduction plan. I think it can give you some comfort in relation to the whether this decision, I suppose, implements or assists with the implementation of the emissions reduction plan. But as I say, it's in the context of that being something you have regard to. So I think just be a little bit careful about the weight that you give that. I think the other point that we would make, I suppose, is the emission trading scheme is a framework, and I think you kind of had that. It's one of the tools in the toolbox. The companies that are reliant on this resource have other pulls on their decision making, including their own customers that will drive outcomes to a degree too. And we don't really know or have any certainty around how that plays out. So I think you're left in that respect with the evidence that is presented to you in the context of this hearing. and I would, I suppose, caution against relying on information that you may have heard in other hearings. If you think that you don't have enough evidence around that test of national public benefit, then I think it is necessary to request further information rather than looking to go outside of the process. But equally, again, thinking about it in the context of that framework that I think both, at least we're agreed on what that decision-making framework is for a plan. And then equally, the fact this is a plan decision and is setting up a framework for consideration of a resource consent. I think too, Commissioner Hovell's question around, well, why does any of this matter if you've got an application in already, which is a fair question. However, we have just filed that application. We don't know how that will play out yet. We may choose to wait to see whether this precinct framework lands, if we feel that that's necessary to assist with the decision making on that resource consent. And obviously this question of the impact of the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land is very much an outstanding question for us in that process. So in some ways the timing of this district plan review was useful, but equally it may prove, depending on that resource consent, to be that they're slightly misaligned. But I don't think that the presence of that resource consent should have any role in the decision that you've got to make in relation to these submissions. They need to be determined on their merits.
Very helpful, and we'll hear from Mr. Garbutt. Just might impact on your decision with regard to timing then. The last of our hearings is in March of next year, and I expect it's this time next year that decisions will be released. So I'll hand over to Mr. Garbutt, and I guess the issue that you're commenting on is that in hearing stream 1, both the planning evidence and the legal submissions that came from your colleague had listed the matters that we had to take into account, other matters have regard to, and to what extent in things like the regional policy statement, like the emissions reduction plan that were referred to in those submissions, do we as panel members actually look at and come back and pose questions, or do we just rely on the evidence that's given to us?
Yeah, I'll respond to that directly initially, and then there's a submission I'd like to make in response to the test about significant national benefit, if I may, and so that Ms. Irving can respond to it while she's here. In terms of your initial question, Commissioner Hovell, you are in an adjudication role, so what you do need to ensure is that the participants in it have had appropriate regard to the relevant matters, such as giving effect to the RPS, achieving the purpose of the Act with objectives and the like. So it's right that you have one eye on those higher order documents and ask questions about have they been either had regard to in the preparation of the plan, or does the plan give effect to the relevant provisions. And it's appropriate that you ask participants and submitters who come along, are there better ways to do that? But what I would submit that you shouldn't do is, it's not your role to go and read them and then form your own views and come up with answers that you might think better achieve a higher order document in your own mind. It's right that you ask participants whether they have those, not that you engage in that initial planning role yourself, because each one of you might have a different role if you wrote the plan yourself. as you might come up with different answers. You're here to adjudicate on what the evidence is and test that evidence and ask submitters and the council whether there are other ways or better ways to achieve the higher order documents, but not to go and do that yourself. So I hope that answers that question. The submission I wanted to make specifically about this submitter is really picking up on one of the issues raised in questions, and that is around the test of significant national benefit. And what I wanted to submit to you is that it is a matter of testing whether this mineral extraction proposal achieves a significant national benefit. And my submission really is it's not probably appropriate or even achievable to expect this submitter to run a comparative exercise across the country to sort of rank in some sort of way how this proposal might rank compared to others, either in this industry or any others, because that's probably an endless and impossible task in my submission. And there can also be, in my submission, a number of mineral extractions that all have significant national public benefit. It doesn't have to be one, there can be a number that each individually have a significant national public benefit. So it's not a matter of finding the one that has the best, there can be quite a number. So I do caution against the possibly understandable desire to say, well, how does this rank in comparison to others that we know about or might think up, because this submitter won't have access to the information like they've presented to you in their evidence about employment, revenue and all the other benefits they've submitted in evidence. So going back to the previous comment I'd already made, I do consider and I support Ms Irving in that you need to confine your decision making to the evidence that you've heard on this proposal. Ask yourself, does this proposal achieve the test in the NPS? And in my submission, the evidence you've actually got from the relevant experts is not actually in dispute. So unless there's something in that leaves you unsatisfied, as Ms Irving says, you can ask for more evidence from the participants if you feel it's needed, but we don't think it is, and probably the submitter doesn't either. So that's what I wanted to submit to you, and happy to answer questions on that, or I'm sure Ms Irving might want to comment and reply. Thank you.
So I appreciate that, and I did see that the peer review, you know, was had landed in a similar space, but perhaps a slightly different interpretation. So I understand that, you know, the couple of experts have looked and sort of gone, well, yes, probably, for these reasons, or come at it from slightly different routes. So I'm happy to and do accept your point that our decision is based on the evidence and the testing of the evidence, and that will guide us in terms of where we land. Yeah, I guess I am kind of troubled, and I take your point again around comparative analysis. But I guess my reason for asking that question and thinking that way is because I've got a sort of a residual worry in your even now when you were giving your statement, and I fully accept there'll be a number of proposals and businesses and things that would hit the national benefit mark, but it's kind of left me wondering if it's a test, you know, what would not meet, you know, there's got to be some sort of threshold in a test, and yeah. So anyway, but I appreciate your point that, you know, we've got the evidence that we've got, and we really appreciate the expertise that has been brought to the question, both on the peer review and the evidence of Mr Schultz that's been relied upon. So, and not in any way diminishing that at all. But I think it is because, as came through legal submissions and through the expert evidence, you know, the benchmarking and testing of this idea is pretty new. So it's valuable to think about what might meet the test and what wouldn't meet the test, and how on earth you draw that line. And even when you gave your answer just then, I thought, well, I still have that question, because if you think that, you know, any number of, so I guess, thank you though. Well, those will be things on our mind when we're writing up and working with the evidence. So I appreciate that.
I probably actually don't have a lot to add to what Mr. Garbutt has said. I think he's summarised it well. I mean, I acknowledge it's a challenge when you're dealing with a new test. But I think we'll learn by example, and I think we've got a case here where we've got evidence with more than one analysis coming at it from slightly different angles that reaches the same conclusion. So I think you can take some confidence from that, you know, we will no doubt get an opportunity to test further examples through other processes, and there will inevitably be some that don't get there. I would suggest this isn't one of them.
Thank you for your evidence and submission, both those present and online. It's been extremely helpful, and of course we will be discussing or meeting with you again when we discuss some other matters. And I will, and also Mr. Garbutt, thank you. I'll adjourn the hearing, and we'll consider some deliberation now. Thank you.
We've still got questions to Joe, so we need to come back in how long? 45 minutes?
Sorry, Joe.
1:30 now.
It's okay.
1:30? 12:38 now.
Can I ask, do you want me here for that? You've got no more. Do you have any legal? I know you've got specific questions. Yeah. I'm happy to support Joe and come back, or.
No, I don't think
We'll see.
Yeah. Went through our list this morning. I think that's fine.
Okay, thank you very much. Cheers.
Yeah.